It is a true honor to be here, and I'm incredibly thankful for the invitation. But most importantly, just thankful for the leadership here. Ross, you and the entire team are just, making sure this issue isn't just an issue where we're talking about kind of the regional consequences of this or the small scale consequences, but about how exactly do we address these issues in a holistic fashion. And that's why I'm so humbled and so honored to be here, because exactly what you're doing here is exactly the kind of work that needs to be taking place everywhere. About how exactly do we protect, how exactly do we make all people feel like they're part of this larger journey. So very quick, if I can just ask the students who are here to either just stand up or raise their hands. I want to specifically give y'all a shout out because this has been the greatest thing about this entire process, has been the idea that we've been able to work and interact with and do service projects with students all over the country. I was with a group of students actually in Kansas City. But the greatest thing about the process has been times like now, where you get a chance to be surrounded by people who are genuine heroes and who are doing this work every day, not just because they feel like it's some type of moral obligation, but because this is a societal obligation. Things like that have really made the entire process worthwhile, to get a chance to see all these amazing organizations that are doing incredible work. And for people who understand that in order for us to have a genuine conversation about the future of our communities, we cannot have a genuine conversation if only a slither of the population is part of that conversation. And then we can never have a genuine conversation about the future of our communities if only a slither of the population is even being thought about. It's about much more than just one neighborhood. It's about much more than just one race. It's about much more than just one socioeconomic group. It's about much more than just one generation. But it's about all of us. It's about the decisions that we make in our lives. And just as important, the people who we have in our lives who help us to make those decisions. The people we have in our lives who help those decisions either make sense or make no sense. Because there are Wes Moores that exist in each and every one of our communities, in each and every one of our schools, in each and every one of our homes. Kids who are literally one decision away from going in one direction or going in a completely different direction. Kids who are literally standing on the cusp of greatness and don't even know it. And are literally just waiting for that push, either in the right direction, either those accidental steps in the right direction or those unfortunate stumbles in the wrong direction. And what we do and how we involve ourselves in that conversation can help make all the difference. The point of this organization, the point of New Neighborhoods, and the point of this idea of housing is that it's about much more than just housing. It's also about what housing represents. It's also about the idea that a house and a home isn't simply shelter. It's protection. Both physical, spiritual, and emotional protection. It's a chance to actually have a vested interest in a community that's bigger than just yourselves. It's a chance to feel like you're part of something bigger and part of this larger American conversation. That's the point. It's not simply about four walls and a roof, but it's about the lives that are involved in making sure everyone feels a part of a community. My story basically starts, we were raised down in Baltimore and raised down in Maryland. And I was born down in Maryland. And when I was 3.5 years old, I watched my father die in front of me. And my father was my hero. He was everything that I ever wanted to be. And I only have two memories of him, and the second memory that I have of him was literally when I watched him die. And as difficult as I thought I had it, the person who really had it toughest was my mother. And my mother, now here she was in her late 20s, she was now a widow with 3 children that she was going to raise on her own. And this in no way was the life that she had prepared for or the life that she had expected. And we were living in a tough neighborhood, and after a couple years staying down there by ourselves, my mother realized that she couldn't do it on her own. And so she called up my grandparents, her parents, who were living up in the Bronx. When we moved up there, and we moved into this home, I quickly found myself getting very lost. I quickly found myself searching for this definition of manhood from a whole bunch of people who quite honestly had no business teaching me anything. I quickly found myself trying to get acceptance and trying to gain acceptance from a bunch of friends. You know, people who told you to go do X, Y, and Z, and you go do it and you go get in trouble. And then when you get in trouble, you turn around and your friends are nowhere to be found. And my mother felt that with every time she was pushing, that's the harder I just kept pulling. And when I was about 8 years old, she one day came into my room and she's like, she looked at my report card and she said, "You got to be kidding me." And she's like, "If you don't get this together, I'm going to send you to military school." So I looked at her and I was like, "Mommy, I can see you're mad and I'll work harder." So one day when I was about 13 years old, she came up to me and she's like, "I'm going to send you to military school." And I looked at her and I said, "Mommy, I can see you're serious now and I'm going to work harder." And she's like, "Nah, you going next week." And she sent me up to my room and started packing my stuff up, started sending me away. And quite honestly, even when we packed up the car, I assumed that we would just drive around the block a few times, and I have to like pinch myself to make myself cry or something. The problem was she kept on driving, and she drove all the way to Pennsylvania, and she drove to a place called Valley Forge Military Academy. I know, I'm not sure where Max is, but I know we have another VF graduate here. And eventually, after the first 4 days, I had already run away 4 times. And so that night, I planned this whole big great escape. Eventually, I just sit down, probably after like 15 minutes. It felt like 3 hours. But I just sit down, and I start crying. And not just because I'm scared, because I'm terrified, but also now I feel very alone. I feel hurt. I feel angry that no one's listening to me. Because people are always telling me, they're like, "Oh, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to work harder." All, you know, I'm like, I don't care. Just let me go home. Which was Mom. Mom wasn't sitting here for me for about 8 weeks. And now here it is on day 4 at 1 o'clock in the morning. She gets a phone call. So she's freaking out. I'm like, "Mommy, listen, I'm okay. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. But I'm really ready to go home. You know, I'll go to school more often. I'll clean my room, your room. I'll do whatever you want me to do. Just let me come home." And as I'm in the middle of this tirade, she stops me. And she says, "Too many people have sacrificed in order for you to be there. And too many people are rooting for you. And you've got to understand, it's not all about you. It's not all about you." I had no idea what she was talking about at the time, but I later on found out, in fact, in the process of actually researching this book and this story, that when she talked about the people who are sacrificing on behalf is, you know, my mother had wanted to send me away to this school for a while, but she came nowhere close to affording it. My mother then eventually wrote a letter to her friends and colleagues and family members saying this is what she wants to do, but she needs help. And people gave what they could, a couple $100, whatever, but my mother was still thousands of dollars short. And when my grandparents, her parents, heard about that small home they had over in the South Bronx, that they put all their retirement money, and they immigrated to this country. They put all their retirement money into it, and that was their retirement money. They ended up taking the money out of their home and helping to pay for that first year of military school. Something that I was this close to completely throwing away. And so I listened to my mother talk. And after 5 minutes, they said, "Your time is up." I gave them back the phone. They hung up the phone. They sent me back up to my room. And I'd be lying if I said anything changed that night, because it didn't. You know, I went to bed that night just as angry as I went to bed the night before. And I woke up the next morning even angrier. But eventually, I began to understand what she was talking about. And eventually, I began to understand that the only way that I was going to make it was if my plea brothers were there to push me. And the only way that they were going to make it was if I was there to push them. We needed each other more than we ever could have imagined. Because what was going to happen at the end of that process was we were either going to succeed as a team or we were going to fail as a team. It was our choice. By the end of that first year, I ended up, I was doing okay academically, and I could play sports because I wasn't on probation anymore. And They gave me some ranks, and now I was in charge of people, so I was feeling good. And for the first time, when people asked my mom, how's Wes doing? She could say he's doing okay and not be lying. Joined the Army right out of high school, went to community college. After community college, went to Johns Hopkins University. And it was while I was at Johns Hopkins University that the Baltimore Sun, which is my hometown paper, wrote a piece about this local kid who had just received the Rhodes Scholarship. And how they talked about, despite a lot of challenges, but a lot of people who cared about me in ways that, quite honestly, I didn't even care about myself. I just received this award, and I was on my way to Oxford. And at the same time, the Baltimore Sun was writing a whole series of articles on 4 guys who one day walked into a jewelry store. The first 2 guys walked into the jewelry store, and when they walked in the store, they reached in their coats, and they pulled out guns. They cocked the guns back and started pointing the guns at everybody in the store and telling everybody to get on the ground and keep your hands on top of your heads. And everybody who was inside the store got on the ground and put their hands on top of their heads like they were told. And about 10 seconds later, 2 other guys walked in the jewelry store, and they reached in their coats and they pulled out mallets. One guy with a gun, one guy with a mallet went to the left, and one guy with a gun and one guy with a mallet went to the right. The ones with the guns were keeping everybody on the ground, while the ones with the mallets were walking around and just smashing out jewelry cases and taking out watches and rings and necklaces. The 4 guys met in the back of the store with a little over $400,000 worth of jewelry. And one of them yelled, "Let's go," and then all 4 guys then ran out of the center of the store and ran outside to the adjacent parking lot. One of the people that was inside the store that day was an off-duty police officer who was moonlighting as a security guard. He was a 13-year veteran of the Baltimore Police Force. He was a 3-time recipient of Police Officer of the Year. He was also a father of 5 who just had triplets. The reason he was working that day was because it was his day off from the police force, and he took on this second job to make extra money for his family. And he got up off the ground, and he ran outside to see if he could stop the guys from getting away. And when he ran outside, he started kneeling next to cars and kneeling next to vehicles to give himself cover. And he didn't realize that one of the vehicles that he was kneeling next to was one of the vehicles that the guys were in. And then a window rolled down, and then 3 shots were taken at point-blank range. And he was killed instantly. And after a 12-day national manhunt, all 4 guys were caught. One of the people that the police were looking for that was eventually captured, tried, convicted, and sentenced for the crime was a guy whose name was also Wes Moore. And the more I learned about this crime, and the more I learned about this tragedy, and the more I learned about the people who were there and responsible, the more I realized how much more Wes and I had in common than just our names. I realized the fact that we were from the same neighborhood, literally living blocks away from each other. I realized the fact that we both grew up in single-parent households, that we both had academic and disciplinary troubles growing up, the fact that we both were around the same age. So then I started thinking to myself, so how does this happen? How do you get 2 kids with similar backgrounds and similar circumstances who end up going in 2 completely different places? That as I'm getting ready to head to England on a scholarship, 3,000 miles away from home, but I wrote him this note. And a month later, I received a letter back from Jessup Correctional Institution from Wes Moore. And it'd be one thing if the letter I would have gotten back from Wes, if it was like he wrote it in crayon or magic marker with his whole hands, and it didn't make any sense, and I would open that letter, and honestly, if I would have opened that letter, I would have looked at that and said to myself, you know what, I get it. This makes sense. The problem is that I've never received that letter. The problem is that the letter I did receive from Wes was one of the most interesting and articulate letters that I've ever received in my life. And it only led to more questions. So eventually that one letter turned into dozens of letters, those dozens of letters turned into dozens of visits, and now I've known Wes for over 8 years. Wes is going to spend the rest of his life in a 6x8 cell. The question that I wanted to ask was, why was his fate sealed so long before February 7th of 2000? And what can we learn and what can we do to help keep avoidable tragedies like what happened with Sergeant Prothero from happening? And I mean, I was speaking with Roz about this earlier. You know, there is no one thing. There's no single thing that we can give a child and say, oh, they have this, they'll be fine with it. Because fact is, raising kids is amazingly complicated. And when you happen to raise kids in some of the most precarious communities and in precarious environments in our country, it's that much more complicated. But there are some things that fundamentally matter. And one of them is making sure that people can come up in a strong, stable, and secure community. It matters. It matters because it helps people to understand that there's more than just what's directly right there.